Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is with a heavy heart and solemn remembrance that I rise today to honor the life and legacy of a former First Lady of the United States, former First Lady of the state of Georgia, a great wife, loving mother, doting grandmother, and great-grandmother, a dedicated servant leader and friend of long standing, Mrs. Rosalynn Smith Carter. Sadly, Mrs. Carter transitioned this life on November 19, 2023. Her funeral service was held at 11 a.m. on Wednesday, November 29, 2023, at the Maranatha Baptist Church in her home of Plains, Georgia. Rosalynn Smith Carter was born and raised in Plains, Georgia, to the union of Wilburn Edgar Smith and Frances Alethea Allie Murray Smith. She graduated valedictorian from Plains High School and attended Georgia Southwestern College, now Georgia Southwestern State University in Americus, Georgia, where she served as vice president of her class and graduated in 1946. In 1945, she began dating James Earl Jimmy Carter, Jr., also from Plains, and whose family farmed peanuts. Jimmy was attending the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland at the time, and they were married in Plains on July 7, 1946. And they would go on to spend 77 cherished years together. Following the death of her father-in-law, James Earl Carter Sr., in 1953, Rosalynn, Jimmy, and their 3 sons returned to Plains, Georgia from Norfolk, Virginia, where he had been stationed in the Navy, as Jimmy was now tasked with running the family business. Rosalynn took over its bookkeeping, and she proved herself a formidable business partner. After her husband was elected to the Georgia State Senate in 1962, her role on the peanut farm grew, especially while he traveled to Atlanta for legislative sessions. In 1970, Senator Jimmy Carter launched his campaign for governor, and Rosalynn took a leading role on the campaign trail. In addition to handling most of her husband's political correspondence and meeting with constituents, Mrs. Carter began to travel across the state of Georgia to campaign in his behalf. Following Jimmy Carter's election as governor, Mrs. Carter served as Georgia's First Lady from 1971 to 1975, where she would take on the role of Governor Carter's trusted advisor and confidant. She was appointed to the Governor's Commission to improve services for the mentally and emotionally handicapped, where she formally began working on one of her foremost initiatives, improving and breaking the stigma surrounding mental health. In 1972, Governor Carter gave me, a young beginning lawyer, my first political appointment, a seat on the Governor's Advisory Council on Drug Abuse. Governor Carter completed his term in January of 1975, and Georgia's Constitution then banned its governors from serving successive terms. Prior to moving back to Plains, Governor Carter had already announced his intention to run for President of the United States in the 1976 election. Rosalynn Carter once again joined the campaign and quickly began traveling the nation on her husband's behalf to tell American voters why this soft-spoken Georgia peanut farmer should become President of the United States. In November of 1976, Jimmy Carter was elected President of the United States, and Rosalynn accompanied him to the White House, where she would make her mark in defining what it meant to be America's First Lady. While serving as First Lady of the United States from 1977 to 1981, Mrs. Carter made it clear that she had no intention of solely carrying out the duties traditionally left to wives of presidents. As an equal partner to her husband, she attended many cabinet meetings and attended weekly business meetings with President Carter, where she would be informed and could give meaningful advice and counsel to the policy issues of the day. The egalitarian relationship between President and Mrs. Carter drew widespread interest, but also criticism from those who believe the wife of the U.S. president should focus solely on homemaking and hosting White House parties and events for foreign dignitaries. The Carters brushed their critics aside, and in 1977, President Carter appointed Rosalynn the honorary chair of the President's Commission on Mental Health. In 1979, the Commission submitted a mental health systems bill to Congress, and Mrs. Carter testified in support of the bill before a U.S. Senate subcommittee, becoming the first presidential wife since Eleanor Roosevelt to do so. Subsequently, the Mental Health Systems Act was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Carter on October 7, 1980. Following President Carter's loss in the 1980 presidential election, the Carter family returned to Plains, Georgia, where they continued to make a positive impact on both their local community and the world. Mr. and Mrs. Carter continued their ministry of service after their time in the White House with the same vigor and urgency, becoming heavily involved in Habitat for Humanity, whose international headquarters was then located in Americus, Georgia. The Carters' work with Habitat for Humanity drew national attention through the annual Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter Work Project, which helped the upstart nonprofit organization grow and construct thousands and thousands of new homes for low and middle-income families. In 1982, Rosalynn and Jimmy founded the Carter Center, a nonprofit human rights organization which has since become famous for its work to eradicate disease, strengthen democracies, and alleviate human suffering all around the world. Mrs. Carter served as the vice chair of the Carter Center from 1986 to 2005 and served as a member of the Board of Trustees from 2005 until her death. Throughout her life, she sought to improve the quality of life of those who suffered from mental illness and disability, including those who care for them. Mrs. Carter established the Rosalynn Carter Institute for Caregivers in 1987 at her alma mater, Georgia Southwestern State University in Americus. Today, the Rosalynn Carter Institute supports caregivers across the United States through research, creating dementia and Alzheimer's disease programs and other tools that help Americans learn how to be effective caregivers to their loved ones. Mother Teresa once said, "A life not lived for others is not a life." I can say without a shadow of a doubt that Rosalynn Carter lived her life for others and went beyond the call of duty to do so. It's been an honor to know Rosalynn and Jimmy Carter for more than half a century, and I will always cherish their friendship as well as their sage counsel and advice, which has been invaluable to me as I've served in Congress. They have been my constituents for 31 years, and they did not hold back in expressing their opinion on the issues of the day. Together they rose to great heights, supporting and cherishing one another along the way as they served the world around them. From the Plains peanut fields to the governor's mansion to the White House and to communities around the globe, they always remained grounded, and Plains remained home in their hearts. Rosalynn Carter accomplished so much for so many for so long. She did so with the grace of God as well as the love and support of her devoted husband, their 5 children, their 22 grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Mr. Speaker, I ask my colleagues of the United States House of Representatives to join my wife Vivian and me, along with the more than 765,000 people of Georgia's 2nd Congressional District and people all around the world, in honoring the great service to humanity of Mrs. Rosalynn Carter and extending our deepest sympathies to her family. At this time, I would like to yield such time as he may consume to my colleague from Georgia, from the 8th District, my good friend, the Honorable Austin Scott of the 8th District of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my friend and colleague, Congressman Bishop, for his courtesy and for leading this. And as we're here to honor the former First Lady of both Georgia and the United States, Rosalynn Carter. She was a great lady, an outstanding Georgian, a Navy spouse, a distinguished humanitarian who dedicated her life in bettering her country and her community. I want to say this about both her and President Carter. The Carter name is synonymous with a faith in and a love for Jesus Christ. And anybody in our part of the state, I lived about an hour from them, who knows the Carter family and their legacy, is that they continue to teach and be active in their church. And they are just wonderful people. They love Georgia. They love the United States of America. And specifically, they loved rural Georgia and South Georgia. And she would have been very proud, I know, that all 5 of the First Ladies were there in a bipartisan manner to show respect to her at her memorial service in a bipartisan manner. She was born and raised in Plains, Georgia. She attended Georgia Southwestern College before she married former President, beloved Georgia Governor and farmer Jimmy Carter. What you might not know is that she first saw President Carter, was attracted to President Carter, when she saw him in his naval uniform as he was a graduate of the Naval Academy. But she was his equivalent in every way when they served together, whether it was as First Lady of our great state from 1971 to 75 or as First Lady of the United States of America. She's a long-term advocate of mental health in Georgia, aiming to increase mental health services and to stop the stigma that surrounds mental illness. She was appointed to serve on the Governor's Commission to improve resources for the mentally and emotionally handicapped. She volunteered at the Georgia Regional Hospital in Atlanta and was an honorary chairperson for the Georgia Special Olympics. After her husband became President of the United States in 1977, it was Ms. Carter who elevated the role of the First Lady for the generations to come by continuing to work to improve mental health services across the United States. And she actually sat in on cabinet meetings, and if I'm not mistaken, she was the first of the First Ladies to sit in on the cabinet meetings. During her time in the White House, the mental health care was one of her priorities to increase government assistance to the mentally ill. She later became an honorary chair of the President's Commission on Mental Health. After leaving the White House, she co-founded the Carter Center alongside her husband in 1982 to advocate for democracy and peace across the globe and establish mental health programs to collaborate on mental health policy. Her passion for mental health advocacy encouraged her to create the Rosalynn Carter Institute for Caregivers, which addresses issues in caregiving, not just in the United States, but internationally. She was also the sponsor of the USS Jimmy Carter, one of the most distinguished submarines in the history of the United States Navy. A sponsor is named by the Secretary of the Navy, and the sponsor's role is an important one. Ms. Carter participated in many of the milestones in the life of her ship, including smashing the bottle against the bow of the submarine and bestowing its name in 2004. The following year, the USS Jimmy Carter was commissioned and entered the fleet after she said in her role as sponsor, "Man our ship and bring her to life." Rosalynn Carter's dedication to public service made her an inspiration to everyone. Our nation is thankful for her grace and bipartisanship as First Lady. Our prayers are with President Jimmy Carter and the Carter family. May we can continue to carry her patriotic legacy as we serve the people of our nation. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my friend and colleague, Congressman Bishop, for leading this hour. I want to thank the Carter family for their service to this country. And with that, I yield the time.
I thank the gentleman from Georgia, my friend and my colleague, and I thank you for joining with me in organizing today's bipartisan special order hour in honor of First Lady Rosalynn Carter. At this time, I would like to recognize my colleague from Georgia, the gentleman from the 13th District, and the ranking member of the Agriculture Committee, Mr. David Scott.
Thank you.
for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Congressman Bishop. Ladies and gentlemen, I rise at this time feeling a great honor to be here in the House of Representatives of the United States to say a few words about an extraordinary person. You know, as I reflect, I am thinking of 3 specific instances of my interaction with this wonderful lady that I think shares a great light on the legacy of her story. One was where I served in the Georgia State Senate, and I was chairman of the State Senate Rules Committee, and we were dealing with a very serious issue facing our farmers, particularly our peanut farmers. And into the committee walked this lady, Miss Rosalynn Carter, to express the need to help these farmers. And it ruled the day because there was some debate on that. But she turned it and gave a resounding victory, helped give that victory to our farmers. And then the other incident was in the Rules Committee, we had another bill. It was to give our young people of Georgia scholarships in our university systems. And some had great problems with that. It was our good friend Zell Miller's bill, Governor Zell Miller at the time. And some wanted to reference it as gambling because it was related to that. However, with Rosalynn Carter there, again, she was able to help get a victory. And now the third time was when Rosalynn Carter came into my district in Georgia. It was in the neighborhood of Summer Hill and Grant Park. And there she was with us all, hammering nails and building houses for those that needed houses in my district. What a lady. And you know, Mr. Speaker, them that's got shall get, and them that's not shall lose. Because the Bible says, and it still is news, your mama may have and your papa may have, but God bless the child that's got its own. And Mr. Speaker, Rosalynn Carter was most assuredly a child of God. And we thank God for sending Miss Rosalynn Carter our way. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Scott. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Georgia's 1st Congressional District, the Honorable Buddy Carter.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank him for hosting this. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor and to remember the life of the late First Lady Rosalynn Carter, a trailblazer, a great American, a strong Christian, and an icon in the state of Georgia. Born in 1927 in Plains, Georgia, like her husband, Miss Carter came from very humble beginnings. She was the valedictorian of Plains High School and soon after, a proud graduate of Georgia Southwestern College. She married the future president, Jimmy Carter, in 1946, whom she remained dutifully married to until her passing this past November. Rosalynn Carter wasn't just any Georgian. She was one of the best. Her entire life exemplifies what it means to be selfless, to serve others and her community. She dedicated herself to improving the lives of those around her, the lives of Georgians, and the lives of Americans. She became a pioneer in the mental health space, helping to found the Carter Center with the mission of alleviating human suffering and advancing human rights. She was also active in Habitat for Humanity, building homes for the less fortunate members of our community. Through her entire life, Rosalynn Carter lived with the mission of leaving the world a better place than when she got here. I want to pay particular attention to her work in the mental health space. Rosalynn Carter was a trailblazer in mental health issues. At a time when mental health issues were something that weren't accepted in this country, she led. For that, I think she will always be thanked. Through her entire life, she lived with the mission of leaving the world a better place than when she got here. I can confidently say she accomplished that mission. And though she is no longer with us, her legacy and her impact have been felt by millions and will be felt by millions in the future. I had the pleasure of serving with her grandson, Jason, in the Georgia State Senate. I remember how proud Jason was of his grandparents. I remember the love that he expressed for his grandmother. Mr. Speaker, in our lives, there are people and places we remember. For the state of Georgia, we always will remember Rosalynn Carter. An inspiration to all of us. My prayers are with her family, with former President Carter, and the millions of Americans affected by her loss. Thank you again to my colleague from Georgia for inviting me to speak today and giving me this opportunity to honor one of the true great Georgians of our time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Carter. At this time, I would recognize the gentleman from Georgia's 4th Congressional District, Mr. Hank Johnson.
I appreciate that, my friend, Representative Sanford Bishop, and I rise in celebration of the remarkable life of an extraordinary woman, a true Georgia treasure, First Lady Rosalynn Carter. I extend my deepest condolences to her family and friends. In my representation of the citizens of Georgia's 4th Congressional District, it is my honor to acknowledge the indelible impact Ms. Carter had, not only on the state of Georgia, but also on our country. From her tireless advocacy for mental health and disability rights to her dedication to humanitarian causes, Rosalynn Carter exemplified the essence of public service. A graduate of Georgia Southwestern College in Americus, Georgia, Rosalynn Carter was an accomplished woman who graduated as valedictorian of her class in 1946. She became an accomplished businesswoman while establishing herself as an equal partner to her husband, Jimmy, who would later become President of the United States. Mrs. Carter was a devoted wife and mother, and her love and support for her husband, President Jimmy Carter, was unwavering. Her grace, resilience, and unwavering commitment to fostering a compassionate society have left an enduring legacy. In her selfless pursuit of making the world a better place, Rosalynn Carter embodied the finest qualities of leadership, even expanding the role of First Lady by attending cabinet meetings and offering wise counsel to her husband and our president. As we celebrate the life of this consummate Southern gentlewoman, let us all commit to living a life such as hers, one that has enriched the fabric of our country and serves as a guiding light for generations to come. I want to thank the gentleman representing Georgia's 2nd Congressional District, Sanford Bishop, for organizing this special order hour. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. And at this time, I would like to recognize my friend and colleague from Georgia's 11th District, Representative Barry Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk.
Thank my friend from Georgia for yielding the time and for setting up this time to honor the life of Rosalynn Carter. I am a native Georgian, and I grew up in Georgia. The town I grew up in is represented by my good friend, Mr. Scott. But where I live now is in North Georgia, in the northern part of the state, and right behind my house is a cemetery that graves date back before the Civil War. There's some even as far back as the late 1700s. I like to walk through that cemetery and think about the history that's there. And as you go to each one of the tombstones there, in most cases you have a birth date and a date of their death, but in between those are the dash. And as I tell my children, it's not the date you were born that matters, nor the date that you die, but it's what you did in that dash that matters. The Carters have left an impact on the state of Georgia that has personally impacted me. I remember as Jimmy Carter and was the governor of Georgia, the 76th governor of Georgia, and Rosalynn was the first lady, and as it's been said here, she was a champion of mental health issues. I was a young Cub Scout who actually was on a field trip to visit the governor's mansion in the state of Georgia in the early 1970s. As a young Cub Scout, I still remember today walking up the steps of the governor's mansion, and I was met at the front door by Governor Jimmy Carter and First Lady Rosalynn Carter. I still remember what a sweet demeanor that she had as she welcomed us into her home, the home of the governor of the state of Georgia. And I also remember that as I stretched my hand out and shook her hand, as I pulled it away, she placed in my hand a bag of peanuts. If you go to any of the offices in Georgia today, you will find bags of peanuts in our offices. And every time I see a bag of peanuts, I reflect back as a young Cub Scout having a bag of peanuts placed in my hand by Rosalynn Carter. I didn't realize that legacy would continue on. As I served in the state Senate in Georgia, I served with their grandson, Jason Carter. Although he was on the other side of the aisle, we became good friends and we worked closely together. We joked about our political differences, but we focused upon the things that we agreed upon, and there were many. In fact, when I won my first election for Congress, one of the first calls of congratulation I received was from the Carter family. But the interaction with the Carters did not end there. Just a few years ago, I was working on a piece of legislation called the BUILD Act. The BUILD Act was to reduce government regulation when it comes to the zero-interest mortgages by charity groups such as Habitat for Humanity. When we were working on this bill in the Financial Services Committee, we reached out to the Carters, who helped us with this very important piece of legislation, putting partisanship aside, with their heart still upon doing everything that they can to help the people of Georgia and help the people of this country. They reached out and helped us move along this bipartisan piece of legislation, which, by the way, was the very last piece of legislation that was signed into law by the previous president, Mr. Donald Trump. This is what Rosalynn Carter's dash was about. It was about the people. It was about leaving an impression upon a young Cub Scout that really lasted a lifetime and was an inspiration to me and is still an inspiration going forward. I thank my colleague from Georgia for taking this time, and Mr. Speaker, I yield the will.
Thank you very much. And at this time, I would like to yield to the gentlelady from the 5th Congressional District, Ms. Nikema Williams.
Thank you, Congressman Bishop, Dean of our Georgia delegation, for chairing today's special order hour, remembering First Lady Rosalynn Carter, a truly remarkable public servant, a wife, a parent, a grandparent, a friend, and humanitarian, and inspiration to countless people around the globe. Mrs. Carter's impact could be seen last week as thousands of people lined up to honor her in Plains, where she lived with her beloved husband, President Jimmy Carter, her husband of 77 years. And then in Americas, where she attended college, and Atlanta, where she co-founded the Carter Center with President Carter. I was one of those people who paid their respects at the Carter Center as she laid in repose. I'm honored to add to the tributes today on the floor of the House of Representatives. I'm very fortunate to have met First Lady Carter on many occasions, and every time that I met her, I was struck by her grace and her kindness and genuineness. Mrs. Carter embodied service and never stopped working to uplift marginalized communities. I was especially fortunate to partner with Mrs. Carter in that work as we uplifted care workers and an increase in investments to the care economy, which is so essential to everything in our lives. She founded the Rosalynn Carter Institute for Caregivers at Georgia Southwestern State University, her alma mater, which today supports 40 million caregivers across the country and will be an enduring living legacy of the former First Lady. Uplifting care workers was only one of the many issues for which Mrs. Carter was an advocate. Mrs. Carter wasn't afraid to advocate for issues long before it was easy or popular to do so. She was a champion for women's rights and one of the leading supporters of the Equal Rights Amendment. She spearheaded the Mental Health System Act of 1980 to end stigmas around mental illness. As First Lady and with the Carter Center, she strengthened democracy around the globe. And of course, who can forget the images of her and President Carter building homes with Habitat for Humanity for many, many decades? The spirit of service was genuine and a defining characteristic of Mrs. Carter's life. The spirit of service embodied by Rosalynn and Jimmy Carter inspired me and my husband, Leslie, to name our only son, Carter, in their honor. Every day we strive to ensure that Carter lives up to the spirit of his namesake. While delivering her eulogy, my friend, Jason Carter, Mrs. Carter's grandson, said his grandmother's life was a sermon. It's true, and all great sermons compel us to act. Mrs. Carter showed us the power of action while using every opportunity given to us. If the House of Representatives uses our opportunity to act every day to improve the lives of our constituents, we will truly have taken the sermon of Rosalynn Carter's life to heart while honoring her in the best way possible. Thank you, Mr. Dean of our delegation, for honoring Mrs. Carter today and hosting the special order hour, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Williams. And at this time, I would like to recognize the gentlelady from Ohio's 9th District, my fellow appropriator, and a dedicated public servant, Ms. Marcy Kaptur.
I thank you very much, the former and soon-to-be again chair of the Agricultural Subcommittee of Appropriations, Mr. Bishop. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to celebrate the life of former First Lady Rosalynn Carter of Plains, Georgia. Born Eleanor Rosalynn Smith, she began dating a young naval cadet named James Earl Carter, Jr. in 1945. The two were inseparable for nearly 8 years. Rosalynn Carter, beloved spouse of President Jimmy Carter and mother to their family and our nation, has blessed our republic for over 3/4 of a century. Her perpetual kindness, wisdom, faithfulness to family, community, and country are legendary. Her patriotism had no bounds. As First Lady of Georgia, and then our nation, she perseveringly and with her matter-of-fact manner elevated the plight of the mentally ill to national attention. I can recall as a farm wife after her husband was elected president, the footage of her carrying her sewing machine into the White House, which stirred surprise and even criticism in some privileged quarters by people who had never worked with their hands. As she tried to show struggling families at home and abroad how to be more self-sufficient. As a White House urban policy staffer after the president was elected, I had the privilege of working with her, a fierce, caring ally, in neighborhood revitalization across our nation in some of the most forgotten corners of America. She was a lady in every sense of the word, but boy, was she determined. She was gracious, erudite, persuasive, faith-filled, indefatigable, committed, and a true credit to our great nation. As others have mentioned, upon leaving the White House, she would go on to be involved in many worthy endeavors both abroad and at home. From hurricane relief to global aid for Africa to Habitat for Humanity building homes for those in need, and to founding the Carter Center, we all know the lasting legacy that Rosalynn and Jimmy Carter left for those who came after them and to future generations. History will treat them well because they helped build a better America and one with a kinder heart. Their lives of public service will be unmatched by any first family in our lifetimes and among the most consequential in our nation's history. May Rosalynn's spirit and memory comfort her husband, her family, staff that served them ably, and all the millions of people the Carter family touched with healing and inspiration. May the angels of mercy carry her to a peaceful rest, and I am so honored to be able to pay tribute to her beautiful life here today. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady. Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time remains?
The gentleman has 24 minutes remaining.
Thank you. At this time, I would like to recognize the gentleman from Tennessee's 9th Congressional District, Representative Steve Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. I appreciate the time. I don't do a lot of these, but when Congressman Bishop asked me to come and recognize and talk about Rosalynn Carter, I had no choice but to say yes. She was a marvelous woman, a marvelous human being, and a great First Lady. The epitome of what a spouse should be, what a mother should be, what a grandmother should be. She did live nearly a perfect life from what we know. She was just a giving person and a caring person. She was very devoted to her religion, and there was not any hypocrisy about her. She lived her life and took actions as the Bible would have taught her to do. She cared about others, and she gave her life to others. The last time I saw her was in Memphis when she was there with her husband. I guess it was 4 or 5 years ago, maybe a little more, and they were there for Habitat for Humanity. And they both got out in blue jeans and whatever, and their hammers and their nails and building houses. And she was with Jimmy and all those things, but she wanted to help people and give people a better opportunity. I've attended the visit to the Carter Center, and that's a great tribute to their years in the White House and what they did to try to make for a better world, which we all should, and they did. But I just had great regard for her. Last night I was at the White House for the Christmas party, and it was a marvelous, marvelous event. And Dr. Biden's done a great job in decorating the White House in the way that it should be, I guess, for people to see the beauty and the wonder of Christmas. But one of the photographs when I walked in was of Rosalynn Carter. And it was in the hallway when you walk in, and I had to stop and look at it on the way going in and on the way coming out. I made a point to go over and look at the name of the artist who'd photographed her, or painted her. I guess it was a painting. But it looked exactly like this, but that's what Rosalynn Carter looked like, and I thought, she's just the perfect expression of love and simplicity And she belonged there. She belonged there so much. I appreciate what she gave to our country, and Jimmy Carter too, and I can mention Jimmy Carter in a way. I did have the opportunity once on a flight from Atlanta to D.C., a Delta flight, of course. Jimmy Carter was on the plane. He got up and he walked through and he shook hands with me. And I thought, wow, that's pretty cool, the president shaking hands with me. And then I turned around and noticed he shook hands with every single person on the airplane because he wanted everybody to have the opportunity to know that they had shaken hands with the President of the United States. That's the way the Carters were. They wanted to share, they wanted to recognize individuals and give them what they had received in life, which is certain moments that they'll never forget and will hold dear. So Rosalynn Carter, I thank you for your life. I thank you for the service, which I watched just about all of, and wonderful expressions by children and grandchildren. Rendition of Imagine, Patricia Yearwood and Garth Brooks, which I think she would have appreciated. But thank you for your life, and thank you for what you gave America. And Sanford Bishop, thank you for inviting me to participate today. I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman for those words. You know, Mrs. Rosalynn Carter did so much in her lifetime, and she held many leadership positions throughout her life. She received numerous awards and recognitions for her work. She serves as the honorary chairperson of the Georgia Special Olympics 1971 to 1975, a member of the Menninger Foundation Board of Trustees 1986 to 2003, chair of the International Women Leaders for Mental Health, honorary fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, and board member emeritus of the National Mental Health Association. She was awarded the Dorothea Dix Award by the Mental Illness Foundation, the Jefferson Award for Greatest Public Service Benefiting the Disadvantaged, the Rhoda and Bernard Sanat International Prize in Mental Health, and was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in 2001. Most notably, in 1999, Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter were jointly awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, by President Bill Clinton. Rosalynn Carter was a great person, not because of the titles that she held, not because of the organizations that she served, but Rosalynn was great because, measured by the true standard of greatness set by Jesus, that he or she who is great among you shall be your servant, and he who is greatest shall be servant unto all. Certainly, without a doubt, Rosalynn Carter measures up. Mr. Speaker, in concluding this special order hour, I'd like to thank my colleague Austin Scott for working with me in order to organize today's event. I'd like to thank the members who joined us in commemorating the life and the legacy of former First Lady Rosalynn Carter. Though Rosalynn Carter has departed from this earth, countless Americans, in fact, countless people worldwide, will continue to have a better life because of her compassion, her dedication, and her public service. We will miss her dearly, but she will remain an inspiration for generations to come. To the Carter family, I want to extend my heartfelt condolences and prayers, and with that, I'd like to close by just reflecting on the fact that I attended the wreath-laying ceremony at Georgia Southwestern State University last week, and the memorial services for Rosalynn Carter held at the Glenn Memorial United Methodist Church at Emory University. During the event, several poignant eulogies were offered. But I'd like to close this special order by reading one that was special from her daughter, Amy Lynn Carter. She said, "My mom spent most of her life in love with my dad. Their partnership and love story was a defining feature of her life. Because he isn't able to speak to you today, I'm going to share some of his words about loving and missing her. This is from a letter he wrote 75 years ago while serving in the Navy. I quote, "My darling, every time I have ever been away from you, I have been thrilled when I returned to discover just how wonderful you are. While I'm away, I try to convince myself that you really are not, could not be, as sweet and beautiful as I remember. But when I see you, I fall in love with you all over again. Does that seem strange to you? Goodbye, darling, until tomorrow." Sir Thomas Gray wrote in his elegy in a country churchyard, "Full many a gem of purest ray serene, the dark, unfathomed caves of oceans bear. Full many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its sweetness on the desert air." We are all so thankful that Rosalynn Smith Carter did not waste her sweetness on the desert air, but from Plains, Georgia, to the United States, for the state of Georgia, and throughout the world, and for all of humankind, she truly made a difference. And we have all been truly blessed by Rosalynn Smith Carter. And so as I close, I leave these words: to God be the glory for the life and the legacy of Rosalynn Smith Carter. With that, I yield back.